Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, this tactical intellectual channel. We have a pretty good continuation here. Now before I really get into my presentation, I had heard that a really good content creator, Mr. Emotep, had passed away. I'm sorry to hear that. I hate to hear that though. And my condolences to his family, friends, and overall everyone who was close to him. I did respect the work that he put up. So of course, this is the Steppe part 2 presentation, so let's go ahead and dive right in it. So as of today is February 3rd 2025. You guys will see this a couple of days later. Of course, I'm still working on this one, but I noticed that I had received some notifications from the Black Danes and Vikings part 3 video presentation, and the guy left comments where he was displaying his uncivilized, uncouth, and unhinged behavior. And that's fine with me. You know, I like to act like Commissioner Gordon, just shine that light, and I have something dangerous behind me that will take out the trash. And instead of it being Batman, it's the truth. Anyway, the concept is this: the same way that Commissioner Gordon attracts the ire of the underbelly of Gotham because of who he has backing him and who he supports, this channel and myself, I will garner hatred from the detractors because of what I represent and what I have backing me. That's just true information and a proper outlook on things. So enough of that analogy to comic book stuff. Let's go ahead and get into the agenda. So the agenda will follow the same game plan as part 1. Here it is on here on the screen. It says Steppe people and their migrations, basic acquaintance on this topic. We're going to do an intro of some sorts, then show genetic evidence, then the outcome of the migration. So let's go ahead and get into the reaction part of it. All right, so let's go ahead and check this video out on the Sintashta Culture, and I'll chime in when I see a need.
The Sintashta culture is a Bronze Age archaeological culture of the North Eurasian steppe, in what is Russia today, close to the border of Kazakhstan. It was a relatively short-lived culture, thriving for perhaps 300 or 400 years, in a relatively small area east of the Ural Mountains. The people here lived in fortified settlements between the Upper Tobol and Ural River valleys, near marshes where their herds of cattle, sheep and horses grazed. This culture is named after a specific site called Sintashta. It was a fortified circular town 140 meters or 460 feet in diameter, surrounded by a timber-reinforced earthen wall with timber gate towers. Outside the wall was a V-shaped ditch as deep as a man's shoulders. It probably had 50 or 60 houses inside, and inside every house were the remains of metalworking activity. Nothing like this had been seen on the Eurasian steppe before. There had been settlements in the river valleys of the western steppe in the early Yamnayan period, 1500 years earlier.
All right, so you notice that timeline, 1500 years earlier. Here we see the early steppe settlements. The Yamnayan, they weren't even around yet, but it was the Kukutani and the Maikop that had merged and became the Yamnayan group of people or tribe. So the Sintashta, they came way later. Let's go ahead and proceed.
Where people from the Kukutani Tripilia culture and the Maikop culture met to trade. But Sintashta was a fortified metallurgical industrial centre, and there were more than 20 settlements like this one, of many different shapes and sizes. As well as their remarkable settlements, we know about these people from their graves beyond the city walls. The elites were buried sometimes in flat graves and sometimes beneath barrows of various sizes. One of these barrows was huge, 85 meters or 280 feet in diameter and 4.5 meters or 15 feet high. The grave goods in these burials, along with the bodies, tells us what these elite people really cared about.
So that's a telltale sign that you're dealing with a descendant of these Yamnayan tribe or confederation of people. Those burial graves, and then how they situated the bodies, the corpses, and then what they were buried with. Let me rewind it back a little bit so I can get the full idea. Okay.
What these elite people really cared about. They were buried with whole horses, up to 8 in a single grave, and with chariots. These were the people who invented the spoked wheel war chariot and who bred horses so magnificent that they replaced all other domesticated horse breeds in the world. All domesticated horses today are descended from those bred by the Sintashta 4,000 years ago. Their graves also contained weapons. These were wealthy men, but they did not care to be buried with many silver and gold ornaments. Instead, they went to the afterlife in their chariots armed with bronze axes and daggers, flint and bone arrows and javelins, socketed bronze spears and polished stone maces. The rulers of these settlements were powerful warlords with retinues of chariot-driving warriors, supported in battle by warbands on foot. These lords controlled enormous resources in bronze and horses, cattle and sheep, and they ruled over skilled horse trainers, woodworkers, metalworkers, and herders. These people spoke the ancient Indo-Iranian language, and they had a truly astonishing legacy, with their descendants spreading south into India and Iran, and thereby having a profound impact on world history.
All right. Yeah, let me stop it right there for a minute. Let me scroll back a little bit. All right, so this is very interesting here. And it's come on now. All right, the map here in the red, of course, that's the Sintashta ground zero of the Sintashta tribe. Then the descendants, Andronovo people, all in blue right there. So they kind of absorbed the Sintashta culture. Maybe a couple generations later, and then the branch where they split off. And to the west, the Iranian people. I spoke about them in my the Near East series. Of course, you had the native people already there, the melanated folks. Then they mixed in with them. But then the big one is the one in blue here to the right, the Aryan. I'm going to replay this in my Indian presentations, yet to be determined. But anyway, let's go ahead and proceed.
Having a profound impact on world history. We'll talk more about that later, but first of all, where did these people come from? Well, amazingly, they have their origins 2,000 kilometers away to the west. Out of the complex interactions of various populations in the Dnieper Valley in the early 3rd millennium BC came the corded ware culture. These people were formed by a mixing of steppe herder men with women from the European farmer cultures west of the Dnieper.
All right, keep that in mind. People that was from the steppe, the men. This is a first, the commencement of these migrations right here. So we already know what these early European people were. They already migrated. They were melanated people, a mix of Australo Negroes and non-Australo Negroes. So the men, steppe men, came in, mixed. Well, I guess they killed the native men, and then mated or got with the native European melanated women. So there's a lot of mixed people going on right now when it comes to this corded ware culture. Now let's go ahead and see what he has to say about all of this.
The corded ware culture is defined by their characteristic burial tradition. Bodies were laid in a grave on their side with bent knees, men on their right, women on their left, and the grave covered with a burial mound. Men were often buried with stone battle axes, and sometimes there were wagons and sacrificed animals in the graves. The people of the corded ware culture spread across northern Europe and are the ancestors of all northern European peoples today. Some of them in the east formed what archaeologists call the Middle Dnieper culture. and some moved into the pine, oak, and birch forests to form a population called the Fatyanovo culture, ultimately spreading through the entire upper Volga basin. Their cultural practices and way of life was still like that of the corded ware people, and they continued to be mobile cattle herders. Ultimately, they discovered the copper ores of the western Ural foothills, and here for the first time they created long-term settlements. This settled copper mining offshoot is still the same people as the Fatyanovo, but it's called the Balanovo culture. There's another important culture within the corded ware horizon, and that's the Abashevo culture to the south. These people occupied the forest steppe ecological zone, and they also stretched all the way to the foothills of the Ural Mountains. Mostly they're defined by their burial mounds, but there are also more than 200 Abashevo settlements known. However, only 2 were clearly fortified, and most were occupied only briefly. Still, it's the very easternmost offshoots of these populations that spread around the southern extent of the Urals and into the upper Ural River basin. And it's these people who would ultimately emerge as the Sintashta culture. The Abashevo were metal workers, utilizing the raw material from the Ural ores to make axes, knives, and socketed spears. And like the later Sintashta, the Abashevo conducted intense warfare. There is one site where a single pit grave, 11 meters or 36 feet long, contained the bodies of 28 young men, 18 of them decapitated, others with axe wounds to the head and arms and dismembered limbs. This mass grave is dated to about 2200 BC and was covered by a single mound. Clearly this was a single event, a single battle, and going by the numbers of dead, it's possible there were hundreds of men fighting on each side.
So you see that their MO was basically war. You know, they had war on the mind. What is it, 187? You know, Snoop Dogg's song was all right, never mind. I'm not gonna get too deep into that, but you know, they were a murderous bunch of people. So let's go ahead and delve into their material culture.
So this was not the tribal raiding and cattle rustling of their corded ware ancestors. This was real warfare. In this context, then, the size of the fortifications and the development of war chariot technology by the Sintashta starts to make sense. Groups of these Abashevo people east of the Urals began to develop their own cultural expressions, their own pottery decorations, for example, and a related but distinct culture emerges.
I like that term, you know, a related but distinct culture emerges. I'm going to use that when I get into my migratory um, bag series and just start talking about different migrations, related but distinct cultures emerge.
We've heard how the Abashevo herders were mining copper and metalworking, and they were fighting large battles. They were also breeding horses and perhaps developing early chariots. So what was so different about the Sintashta that they warrant their own archaeological designation? What was it about their material culture, the physical remnants we have today, that marks them out? Well, they're huge fortified settlements, for one thing. Some were circular, like Sintashta, and the other famous site from this culture, Archaim. Other sites were rectilinear or had irregular shapes, taking advantage of geographical features, but all prioritized their defensive perimeter. They all had V-shaped ditches outside their timber-reinforced earthen walls. Although their ancestors had erected defensive settlements every now and again, they were temporary and on nothing like the scale of the Sintashta. So why did they build them? Well, the lands this side of the Urals were colder and drier than those to the west.
All right, so did you get that? These are the Ural Mountains right there. So got the eastern side, well, the eastern side right here, and western side. So The side that the Sintashta was on became colder and drier. So let's see what he says right here, and I'm gonna chime in again.
And between about 2500 and 2000 BC, the climate of the steppes became even colder and even drier.
So there you have it. He's talking about, first of all, steppe geography, and then the seasonal migrations that occurred. So there's a book, you might have heard of it, called Environment, Race, and Migration by Griffith Taylor. I'm gonna go over that. Um, some snippets of the information that um, agrees with what's being said here, and then you can determine for yourself if it's true, undecided, or is it false, or you can reject it. Fine by me, but everything has to match and line up. So let me rewind it again, and then see what he says.
Of the Sintashta. So why did they build them? Well, the lands this side of the Urals were colder and drier than those to the west. And between about 2500 and 2000 BC, the climate of the steppes became even colder and even drier. There was a network of river valleys amongst the tributaries of the Upper Tobol and Ural rivers. The marshlands of these river systems were vital for feeding their herds of cattle, sheep, and horses, especially in the winter. With the marshes shrinking, the people became less mobile and more committed to defending the resources they had. Most Sintashta settlements were built on the first terrace overlooking the floodplain of a marshy, meandering stream. They would have been more effective fortresses had they been built on nearby hills. But it was the marshlands they were protecting, or rather their herds that fed on them. For all their wealth in bronze and all their skill in battle, they could not live without their herds. So, there were riches to be had here, but they had to be concentrated in specific places, and so the ditches around their towns grew deeper, and the walls higher. Defensive innovations like towers were built behind the walls and gatehouses, and offensive innovations like the light, fast war chariot were developed, along with horses strong enough to pull them. It was no longer just about raiding. This was endemic warfare.
All right, so there you have it in layman's terms. The ease of travel due to climate took a hit. These marshlands, well, they were shrinking again due to climate, and that affected how they cared for their herds. So they had to develop, first of all, that scarcity mentality, and then they had to manifest it by building fortifications that were, I guess, communal, and yeah. I mean, you are already coming from a warlike culture, so all these other tribes that are your brethren or brethren, they were thinking the same thing. Hey, things are scarce. I may have to take it from you, and you know that. So you're like, huh, I'm gonna protect what's mine. So I got this settlement. I'm gonna fortify it. I'm gonna go on the offensive and defensive. So that's how it was in that area, that steppe culture.
These warriors fought not with swords, but with the weapons of their corded-ware ancestors, polished stone maces, copper and bronze daggers, bronze axes, and bows shooting flint and bone-tipped arrows. They also developed larger, heavier flint projectile points for the javelins they hurled from their chariots, which provided a solid base for accurate and powerful throws. The charioteer could throw his javelin further than could an early horse rider, especially as wooden saddles would not be invented for more than 1,000 years, and stirrups for even longer than that. In this atmosphere of intense competition between the rival tribes and clans, there also developed enormous funeral feasts with elaborate ceremonies. We know this because we see the remnants of these feasts in the graves of the elites, who were buried within the site of the walls of their towns. Graves contained huge amounts of bones from the animals slaughtered for these vast feasts, and the horses and chariots sacrificed to honour the glorious dead. As well as mining, metalworking, horse breeding, and warfare, these powerful chiefs also engaged in trade with other societies, some of them weeks or months away by horse. But if they were so successful, powerful, and innovative, why do the archaeologists say that this society existed for only 300 or 400 years? What happened to the Sintashta culture? Well, the cultural expressions of the Sintashta, their rituals, politics, warfare, and language would have a profound effect on the later cultures of the Eurasian steppes. Their descendants would expand from their original homeland in many directions, primarily to the east and southeast, forming what archaeologists call the Andronovo culture, or the Andronovo horizon, because it had multiple regional expressions and phases.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something you have to take note of. We've already kind of touched on this, but I guess he's going to elaborate the migrations of their descendants, the Sintashta. And it's funny because the Sintashta, they're descendants of the Yamnaya themselves. So, I mean, that steppe culture, yeah, it was different.
The Andronovo covered a huge area from the Urals to the Altai and Tian Shan mountains, and continued for a long time, certainly until 1200 BC and arguably later. They continued many of the customs and styles inherited from the Sintashta, including family burial mounds and compact permanent settlements, copper smelting, similar weapon types, and cattle and sheep herding. They also spoke the Indo-Iranian language of their Sintashta forebears, which of course continued to change over time.
Interesting. When I did my Near East and Southwest Asia series, I did mention and highlight the native cultures, the melanated indigenous people, and then an element that came in and changed things up, shook things up. I did reference sex and race, and they did mention that amalgamation happening. So you're seeing that theme again, and just piece everything together and you'll get the full picture, the bigger picture when it comes to this history here.
Some of these people moved south where they diverged, perhaps around 1800 to 1600 BC,
Take a screenshot.
into archaic Iranian speaking and archaic Old Indic speaking groups. The oldest texts in Old Indic are books 2 to 7 of the Rig Veda. These hymns and prayers were compiled into books or mandalas about 1500 to 1300 BC, but many had been composed earlier. And cultural practices like chariot warfare and vast funeral rites, first seen amongst the Sintashta culture, feature in the Rig Veda. The influence of the Sintashta continued in their descendants, both on the steppes and thousands of miles away in distant lands. And
That's definitely something that will pop up again. What is it, you may ask? Well, let's check this out again. Let's reiterate this thing again. Let's reiterate this again. That's how you learn. All right, here we go.
the Urals to the Altai and Tian Shan mountains, and continued for a long time, certainly until 1200 BC and arguably later. They continued many of the customs and styles inherited from the Sintashta, including family burial mounds and compact permanent settlements, copper smelting, similar weapon types, and cattle and sheep herding. They also spoke the Indo-Iranian language of their Sintashta forebears, which of course continued to change over time. Some of these people moved south where they diverged, perhaps around 1800 to 1600 BC, into archaic Iranian speaking and archaic Old Indic speaking groups. The oldest texts in Old Indic are books 2 to 7 of the Rig Veda. These hymns and prayers were compiled into books or mandalas about 1500 to 1300 BC, but many had been composed earlier. and cultural practices like chariot warfare and vast funeral rites, first seen amongst the Sintashta culture, feature in the Rig Veda.
Yeah, I'm gonna use the Rig Veda as a source when I do. I am working on that Indian presentations right now. Just the changeover, the transfer in power or of power. So I, the Rig Veda is very credible in my opinion. I know a lot of people in this day and age like to debunk just for the sake of debunking. You know, I mean, eggs give you cancer, then no, it doesn't give you cancer. Then oranges give you cancer, then oh no, it doesn't give you cancer. That's the climate we live in. But it has to line up and make sense. And the Rig Veda, it makes sense.
The influence of the Sintashta continued in their descendants, both on the steppes and thousands of miles away in distant lands. And it continued in the technology of their war chariots that transformed the nature of warfare even in China and Egypt. And the Sintashta horse breed was so successful that all domesticated horses today are descended from them. So there's no doubt that this relatively short-lived society in a relatively small area east of the Ural Mountains changed the world.
All right, so that was pretty interesting there. Now you guys have some type of knowledge on these, I guess, descendants of the Yamnaya and the Sintashta. They are descendants of Yamnayan people and other steppe tribes. So it's just all about having that in your mind and knowing what's happening so you can keep up. Now we can go ahead and move towards the DNA and genetics portion. All right, so let's go ahead and segue into this video right here. This is really nothing new. It's talking about the ancient DNA in regards to the Yamnayan origins and their language spread, the Indo-European language spread throughout Europe. So let's go ahead and play it and I'll give my input or point some things out where I see fit.
Fascinating new and as yet unreleased research into ancient DNA appears to have settled the origins of the Yamnaya culture. The abstract of a new paper was posted on X, formerly Twitter, ahead of a forthcoming conference in Budapest, Hungary. According to the preview, which has not yet been possible to verify, the study is called The Genetic Origin and Linguistic Expansion of the Indo-Europeans.
All right, so I'm going to try to attempt to find this article and link it in the description for you guys to read at a time convenient for you.
And was carried out by David Reich, David W. Anthony, and Dorcas R. Brown. The paper has tremendous significance as it appears to settle a long-standing debate and retire, or at least strongly refute, the so-called Southern Arc theory, which places the origin of the Yamnaya in the northern Black Sea region. The new research appears to confirm the Kurgan hypothesis that asserts their homeland to be further north, specifically in the Pontic-Caspian steppe region. In a section labelled Part 1, David Reich comments on the genetic origin of the Indo-Europeans. He writes, "To localise the ancestral and geographical origins of the Yamnaya among the diverse Neolithic people that preceded them, we studied ancient DNA data from 428 individuals, of which 299 were reported for the first time, demonstrating 3 previously unknown Neolithic genetic clines."
All right, so when it comes to the Neolithic people and tribes and populations, we know that they were melanated people, whether they be Australo-Negroes or non-Australo-Negroes. That was them.
First, a Caucasus Lower Volga CLV cline suffused with Caucasus hunter-gatherer CHG ancestry extended between a Caucasus Neolithic southern end, including people from Neolithic Armenia, and a steppe northern end, including Neolithic people from Berezhnovka in the Lower Volga. He goes on to say the CLV cline people with Lower Volga ancestry contributed 4/5 of the ancestry of the Yamnaya. Perhaps more significantly, he comments on findings relating to Anatolia. He says the results showed that CLV cline people entering Anatolia from the east contributed at least 1/10 of the ancestry of Bronze Age Central Anatolians, where the Hittite language, related to the Indo-European languages spread by the Yamnaya, was spoken. He added, "We thus propose that the final unity of the speakers of the Proto-Indo-Anatolian ancestral language of both Anatolian and Indo-European languages can be traced to CLV people living in the North Caucasus, Lower Don and Lower Volga, sometime between 4400 and 4000 BCE. In Part 2, David Anthony and Dorcas R. Brown contribute a section on the Yamnaya origins and the expansion of late PIE languages. It read, "The origin and expansion of the Yamnaya culture is difficult to understand without adequate ADNA sampling of populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppes. A new study from the David Reich lab of ADNA from more than 400 Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals from the Pontic-Caspian steppes reveals a complex chronological layering and admixture of multiple ancestries that contributed to Yamnaya genetic origins, probably within the eastern range of the Seredni Sti populations in the early to mid 4th millennium BCE.
All right, they mentioned that everything's complex, but they do mention the main factor that there was an amalgamation or mixture of different types of people from different tribes that made up this Yamnayan tribe or confederation of people.
It has been theorized previously that the Seredni Sti or Sredni Stog culture were the ancestors of the Yamnaya. Indeed, the modified Kurgan hypothesis of Mariah Gimbutas suggests the pre-Kurgan semi-nomadic culture based in modern-day Ukraine to the...
All right, hold on. I'm going to rewind it back a little bit, but that name right there, Mariah Gimbutas or Gimbutas, I'm definitely going to draw for some of her work and check out some of her hypotheses. Let me go ahead and rewind it back a little bit to get the full idea.
Previously that the Seredni Sti or Sredni Stog culture were the ancestors of the Yamnaya. Indeed, the modified Kurgan hypothesis of Mariah Gimbutas suggests the pre-Kurgan semi-nomadic culture based in modern-day Ukraine to the north of Crimea could represent the homeland of the Proto-Indo-European language. The abstract continued, as the Yamnaya population expanded after about 3000 BCE, people who shared steppe genetic ancestry innovated to create new material, archaeological cultures on both the eastern Afanasyevo and western corded were-wings of the expansion, creating what archaeologists often regard as independent cultural entities that obscured a shared genetic and perhaps linguistic heritage. It seems that people who shared genetic ancestry often created distinct material cultures, and occasionally people with similar material cultures had distinct genetic ancestries, Lower Don and Core Yamnaya. Genes and material culture can follow different trajectories, and the comparison of ADNA and archaeology provides a tool to explore their complex relationship.
That's very interesting right there, that some groups that share genetics, they may have different material cultures, and some tribes that share material cultures may have varying genetics. That's something I have to look more into to see that trend. So let's go ahead and move forward.
And it is there that the snippet ends. It will be intriguing to see the full paper, which could reframe the debate around the origins of the Yamnaya and the genesis and spread of the Indo-European languages. And it is here that this video ends also. Don't forget to like.
Alright, so I'm definitely going to wrap this reaction up. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. To put it simply, when it comes to migrations, there's always an outcome, a domino effect. In part 1, I spoke about the outcome of these steppe migrations into other parts of Europe. And in this one, part 2, we're going to uncover evidence and information that wasn't covered. So it's additional information. Let's go ahead and go into it. Alright, so let's go ahead and check out another Yamnayan video speaking more on the final result, the outcome.
By the mid-3rd millennia before Christ, the first signs of civilization began appearing in the Middle East. Settlements gradually grew into cities, paving the road for the rise of the Egyptian and Mesopotamian kingdoms and city-states. During the same time, a similar process was occurring thousands of miles to the north. Centered around the Prut River in modern Romania, the so-called Cucuteni-Tripilia culture had grown to cover an area of 3,000 square kilometers. Unlike the communities of the Fertile Crescent, the members of this culture were almost exclusively farmers. Here in the river valleys of temperate Eastern Europe, the Kukuteni people sustained themselves with agriculture, animal husbandry, and occasionally with hunting.
Yeah, they didn't really look like this. You didn't have any blondes with pale skin. These were Neolithic people, and this was before the Yamnayans came over. So let me go ahead and rewind it back a little bit, and all right, there we go.
The Kukuteni people sustained themselves with agriculture, animal husbandry, and occasionally with hunting. Labor division is still absent, while social hierarchies are relatively egalitarian. Despite that, the Kukuteni culture is remarkably complex for its time. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, the people of this area had established some of the largest settlements in the world. Their biggest towns spanned hundreds of acres, with some boasting an estimated inhabitants of up to 30,000. These massive settlements were built along large oval rings oriented towards a central plaza. They consisted of thousands of wooden houses and structures that were remarkably large for the time. These dwellings were surprisingly similar in size, a testament to the low levels of social stratification. Much like social inequality, warfare also seems to have been a rarity in the lands of the Kukuteni people. This peaceful and tranquil way of existence inspired the creative instinct of the locals. Small figurines, shaped to resemble a female body, have been uncovered all over the area.
All right, so you see these figurines right there. This is kind of more related to what the Australo people, the Negritos, and Near Eastern and African cultures. Not so much. You know what? Let me come up with this conclusion later, and I'll let you guys come up with the conclusion. But let me go ahead and proceed.
Some believe these female totems to be a representation of the chief deity worshipped by the Kukuteni people, a female fertility goddess. The people of these communities enjoyed a relatively egalitarian and peaceful existence. Yet this changed with remarkable speed and efficiency. The steppes of Eastern Europe, 3000 BC. Just to the east of the Kukuteni lies the Yamnayan culture, tall, strong, and warlike. The appearance and life of the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian plain contrast starkly with the ones of their western neighbors.
There's the answer right there. The appearance and lifestyle. Appearance, contrasted with their western neighbors.
In the unforgiving lands of the steppe, agriculture is a rarity, while armed clashes and raids are an often occurrence. In these lands, waging war is an act of devotion to one's clan. Here, war is a state of nature, a harsh reality ordered by the almighty Sky Father, the central deity of the Yamnayan. As opposed to the female fertility goddess of the Kukuteni people, the Sky Father is a symbol of ferociousness and a strict patriarchal order. The top dogs of the Yamnayan, a caste of warrior men, live to raid and raid to live.
See, now there's a caste system right there, rather than it being egalitarian. And I mean, there you have it right there. This is the forefathers of, so much stuff that we see in India and even on up into our day in the Americas.
Their communities are far from egalitarian. The Yamna society is divided according to a strict hierarchy. At the top of the social ladder sits the warrior class, an estate of ambitious men hungry for military prowess and plunder. Despite that, war is far from being the only occupation of the Yamnayan. The locals live a life of pastoralism, traveling around the plains of the steppe with their animal herds throughout the better part of the year, and withdrawing to winter in fortified settlements along the river valleys.
All right, so that fact right there, just that nomadic lifestyle, in the book Environment, Race, and Migration, of course, by Griffith Taylor, it does speak to that, and it merges and marries these two pieces of information together. So We know that this conclusion that I'm coming up with is not far-fetched. It's nothing new. It's always been talked about hundreds of years before I was even born. So I would have to go along with that.
Trade is also an essential part of Yamnaya culture. The inhabitants of the steppe trade with each other as well as with their foreign sedentary neighbors, including the Cucuteni. Yet, as the third millennium before Christ neared its end, the relationship between the two cultures was about to get sour.
All right, so you notice this contrast right here. To your on the right, or to your right, there's the Yamnaya person right there, and then to your left, the only thing dark about him is his hair and the short stature. So the only thing that they got right is black hair, dark hair, and short stature. But that's the Neolithic person right there. So we know he didn't have that pale skin right there. So let's go ahead and move forward.
3200 BC. The climate of Earth is drier and colder than it has ever been since the Ice Age. This severe climate change is devastating to the farming cultures of Europe. While the Cucuteni culture enters a steep decline, its nomadic Yamnaya neighbors fare a lot better, having begun their gradual spread from the Volga River around 4000 BC. By 3000 BC, these pastoralist nomads had reached the southern Bug River, encroaching ever closer to the lands of the sedentary Tripilia culture. Approximately 5,000 years ago, the Cucuteni culture collapsed. Its massive towns drastically plummeted in size, and its people either fled, were assimilated, or outright slaughtered.
Take note of that fact right there. Let me go ahead and rewind it so you can hear it again.
1,000 years ago, the Cucuteni culture collapsed. Its massive towns drastically plummeted in size, and its people either fled, were assimilated, or outright slaughtered. The relatively peaceful locals proved unfit for the new climate and cultural changes. Yet their more resilient eastern neighbors endured and even thrived. Wielding stone axes and copper daggers, raiding bands of Yamna men swept through the land of the Cucuteni. The local grandiose settlements were either razed or abandoned. Many locals submitted to the newcomers, interacting and eventually assimilating into their culture. These natives would also adopt the language of the Yamnaya, a tongue modern linguists call Proto-Indo-European. The dawn of a new era had begun, the era of the Indo-Europeans.
All right, so that really deserves no explanation. It's pretty straightforward. You see what happened. The Yamnaya, they moved to the west. They basically swallowed them folks up, dispatched them, intermarried with them, and kept it moving. So that's what, and also the Cucuteni kind of adopted their speech. So the book, The Place of the Welsh, and what's the other book, Ancient and Modern Britons, it really speaks on that fact that the people that migrated and conquered, they passed their language down to the local culture that they conquered. So you see that theme a lot. To no one's surprise, though, that's how conquest works. It's nothing deep that I'm saying, just rehashing the point.
The migration of the Yamnaya into the land of the Cucuteni culture was only the beginning. At the turn of the second millennium BC, the Indo-Europeans entered Central Europe, giving rise to several new European cultures. Around the early 2000s BC, descendants of the Yamnaya formed the corded ware culture, which was centered around modern Germany and southern Scandinavia.
All right, so let me rewind this because I don't think you guys really grasp the impact of it. A lot of you guys do, but there's some that may not. So let me go ahead and you play it.
Several new European cultures. Around the early 2000s BC, descendants of the Yamnaya formed the corded ware culture, which was centered around modern Germany and southern Scandinavia. From there, the Indo-Europeans continued spreading and diverging into many different cultures, outcompeting and assimilating the native inhabitants of the regions they came to occupy. During the late 2000s BC, the spread of the Yamnayan was exacerbated, a process that was likely caused by technological innovation, particularly in the realm of warfare. The excellent horse breeders of the Indo-European Sintashta culture are credited with the invention of the chariot and possibly even mounted warfare.
All right, so they credit the Sintashta with that, but are they the first ones? Was it Jack Daniels is credited with making very good whiskey, but did he actually come up with that good whiskey, the ingredients? Nah. Elvis is credited with, you see where I'm going with it. So let me rewind this back and let me play something else right quick. There's an interesting fact right here, that corded ware culture. Now, it says that these steppe people, when they migrated to the west, they intermarried with the women of these indigenous European groups. So we all know that the indigenous Europeans were melanated folks, either Australo Negroes, non-Australo Negroes, or that blend between the Australo Negro and non-Australo Negro. So how you think the offspring look? I mean, or let me ask more clear, what do you think the offspring of these steppe cultured people and the indigenous Europeans look like? They were still melanated. All right, so the corded ware culture. And then there was another reaction that I did before this one that mentioned the corded ware culture. And then the descendants of that corded ware culture going back east right there, and then giving rise to the Sintashta. This is some interesting stuff, really convoluted, but it's very interesting.
Indo-Europeans continued spreading and diverging into many different cultures.
All right, so these people, they started diverging and they became different cultures, related but distinct. Now, this is why when I talk about melanated Europe, I give a distinction between that and the African continent, because basically on the whole, these steppe culture people, they didn't really go deep into Africa like that. So Africa retained its culture better than Europe. So I have to make that distinction.
Outcompeting and assimilating the native inhabitants of the regions they came to occupy. During the late 2000s BC, the spread of the Yamnayan was exacerbated, a process that was likely caused by technological innovation, particularly in the realm of warfare. The excellent horse breeders of the Indo-European Sintashta culture are credited with the invention of the chariot and possibly even mounted warfare. During the following 1,000 years, these people gradually spread southwards. Around 1000 BC, descendants of this culture conquered northern India and Iran, subsequently giving rise to the Persian Empire and the civilizations of northern India.
All right, so I did that, the Near East and Southwest Asia series. Of course, you know the native Elamites blended with these, was it Sintashta descendants, and then that gave rise to that Persian Empire. But the original Persians, so to speak, were the Elamites. So these descendants of the steppe people, they just added a little bit and warped the culture a little bit, changed it into something else. But the indigenous people were the Elamites. So let me go ahead and rewind it a little bit to get the full idea. All right, there we go.
During the following 1,000 years, these people gradually spread southwards. Around 1000 BC, descendants of this culture conquered northern India and Iran, subsequently giving rise to the Persian Empire and the civilizations of northern India. Thousands of miles to the northwest, their distant relatives in Europe found similar success. The Indo-European bell beaker culture, likely a descendant or a contemporary of the corded ware, spread all over Western Europe. Exceeding river navigation, the bell beakers established trade routes all over the old continent, trading goods far and wide. Around 2000 BCE, the bell beakers crossed the English Channel and entered Britain. In a short period of time, these Indo-European newcomers had occupied the whole island. The descendants of the bell beaker and corded ware cultures would eventually give rise to the Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Baltic, Slavic, and ancient Greek peoples, the ancestors of nearly all ethno-linguistic groups of modern Europe. The spread of the Indo-European people is a process that remains unparalleled to this day. In 4000 BC, the Yamnayan pastoralists occupied a small section of land around the Volga River. 3,000 years later, their descendants occupied a land area spreading from modern Portugal to modern India.
We've reached the conclusion of this presentation. The reactions were interesting. I enjoyed doing it. Now, one thing about my style and my format is liking it to a chef who's about to cook a big buffet. He's going to take all his ingredients out and just put them on the table. That's not the final product. He hadn't even started measuring yet and preparing things. You haven't seen the final product. One thing I want to do is just put it out there just to show you and give you an idea of what will eventually come later on. And you know that you're going to have a first course, second, third, and all that. And then finally a dessert. My thing is I want to put it out there and then I will organize it later on, time period wise. And I want to just display and showcase the Neolithic and Neolithic cultures, traditions, customs, languages, what they call themselves, what they called other people. And then finally, when the steppe culture element came in and changed gradually and turned Europe into fragments and variations of the original culture and then the steppe culture. So that's my method. And I really do hope people can see that naturally. Some will, some won't, and some will bash and some will not. It's all good, just as long as the information get out there. But anyway, I'm running long on this video here, so let me go ahead and cut it short and I'll see you guys later. I'm working on a follow-up video that is basically a compilation of the information, so it's information heavy, but it's really good. It's proof positive. So take care.